I have made this video to explain how one might approach the manuscripts of Johann Sebastian Bach's 6 suites for cello solo. My edition makes it possible to evaluate conflicting details as to what is correct or questionable, considering sources in the context of chronology and filiation. This example shows a typical page of the manuscripts. You can see a lot of bleed through from the other side of the page, as the ink came through from writing on the back side. The saraband can be seen on line 5, Bourrée 1 on line 8, and Bourrée 2 beginning on the bottom line. The manuscript is very hard to read, and comparison with the other sources is quite difficult. In this presentation, I will first introduce the sources for the Bach suites. This is followed by a tour of my edition, explaining its organization and navigation. I then discuss interpretation of these sources in the context of a timeline and their filiation. This term, filiation, refers to the manner in which a thing is related to another from which it is derived or descended in some respect. I then present further examples that help reveal the filiation of the sources. The last part of the presentation goes into detail with examples of several aspects: pitch, rhythm, Appogiaturas, and slurs. The sources are labeled A through E and H. This example is the first line of Suite 1 from the Untitled Bach copy, known as Source A. She was Bach's second wife and was a trained singer. She made the copy between 1727 and 1731. This is Source B, the copy made by Johann Kellner. The date of this manuscript, 1726 to 1727, is slightly before the Untitled Bach manuscript. Kellner was a German organist and composer. He copied approximately 48 of Bach's works. Then we have Source C, known as Westphal. This copy was discovered in 1830, but had been written sometime in the second half of the 18th century by 2 anonymous professional copyists. The second copyist took over in the first Bourrée of Suite 3. The final handwritten copy is Source D, known as the Treg manuscript. It was made by an anonymous German copyist sometime in the end of the 18th century. It first came to light in 1799, but we do not know where it came from or who wrote it. The first edition, Source E, was published in 1824 in Paris. It perhaps clarifies some things, but many mistakes were made, and there are obvious editorial changes as well. Some of these errors have persisted in modern editions and performances. According to the preface of the edition, it is based on an unidentified copy found in Germany by the cellist Pierre Norblin. For the 5th suite, we also have Source H, which is the Johann Sebastian Bach autograph manuscript of Suite number 3 for lute. This is Bach's arrangement of Suite number 5 in C minor for cello. The cello suite came first and was written in scordatura with the A string tuned down to G. This example shows the courant of Suite 5 in the lute version, Source H. The manuscript is written in Bach's drafting hand, not his fair copy handwriting. In the lute arrangement, Bach transposed the suite into G minor, thus up a fifth. The top line is written in tenor clef, therefore it reads in bass clef in C minor, with the small change that you would have B natural instead of F sharp. That makes the top line easy to compare with the cello suite. When viewed in my edition, one can see all the sources lined up for comparison, with Source H at the top. Modern notation is at the bottom, with fingerings and bowings, and including many indications of details found in the sources. Various signs are used in the edition to compare the manuscripts. The first one to mention is an X, which indicates a note that is different from other sources. The X appears in brackets if it is a note that is likely an error. In this example, the X indicates the pitch G in source A, which is probably wrong. A hashtag sign is used to indicate ornaments. In this example, you again see the use of an X for differing or added notes. Looking at the modern notation below, the first trill is enclosed in parentheses because it does not appear in all sources, and the letters following the trill show that it appears only in sources C and D. The trill in measure 3 is also something we are not used to hearing, but appears in sources B, C, and D. This is new information for most people and may lead to a reassessment of some details in the suites. Then there is a rhythmic duration symbol, the null sign. In this example, some people play 6 16th notes, as seen in source A, but all other sources have an 8th note and 4 16th notes. Therefore, the version in source A is very likely an error. The not equals sign is used for slurs that don't match between sources. They have not been marked on every slur that differs, as that would be quite repetitive. In this example, the sign is on the measure 2 slur in source A. In the other sources, the slur is clearly over 5 notes. In the modern notation at the bottom, editorial dashed slurs are seen in measure 6, but one may choose to do separate détaché bowing as none of the sources have slurs. The asterisk comparison symbol is used when there is a unique marking not found in the other sources. In this example, the slur doesn't appear in the other manuscripts. Here's how it lines up with the other sources. One can also see use of the not equals sign for slurs that differ from the other sources. However, it's interesting to note that in the next line, the sequence of that phrase, the slur is in both sources A and B. That to some extent validates the earlier slur, as there are very few instances in which Bach changes the pattern of slurs during a sequence. In preparation of the edition, I used Photoshop to clean up and align each line from the sources. Getting rid of all the background, one can more clearly see what was written. All of the sources are in public domain and are available online. Here's another example showing how alignment for the edition resulted in a midline break in the stave, removing all the nearby lines. And here's one more example, erasing peripheral debris. This is the title page of the edition. Each underlined text is a hyperlink. These are clickable links that take the view to those destinations. For instance, if we wish to see Suite 2, we then get the directory for that suite. The upper section links to the manuscripts for each movement, and the lower section links to the modern notation. For instance, one can select the score for the courant, and this is what we would see. If you want to look at the manuscripts for that movement, you simply click on the title of the movement or on the page number. At the bottom you can see the first line of the score we were just looking at. The following lines with manuscripts are reached using touch or a foot pedal on an iPad or with the arrow key on a keyboard. Here's line 2 and line 3. Again, touching or clicking on the page number takes you to the score view. Back to the table of contents, Editorial Notes covers the sources and the comparison symbols, as well as discussion about slurs, ornaments, dynamics, and pitches. There is also a list of commands for navigating a PDF. If you are on a computer, this is very helpful. If you are on a touch-sensitive screen such as an iPad, you can simply touch the hyperlink and it jumps to that destination. There is a final section titled Interpretation of the Sources. This is an examination of the sources and their background, and a movement-by-movement list of points of interest, again featuring hyperlinks to view the relevant manuscripts. An understanding of the relationship between the sources is important for interpretation. A good place to start is with the Courant of Suite 5. The interesting things to notice on this page are the red comparison symbol X's in brackets. Examining the lute suite version, source H, one can see the use of tenor and bass clef for the two staves. The bass line, obviously in G minor, has an upward stepwise motion G, A, B flat. Compared with the cello version, Bach added bass notes that are marked with X and a few Appogiaturas that are also marked with X. There are also dots in the third measure that Bach wrote in the lute suite, so it seems appropriate that a cellist would choose to play those notes shorter. The interesting thing to notice is that Anna Magdalena Bach made a mistake, putting two ledger lines on the bass note in the third measure. Sources C, D, and E all reflect the error in source A. This shows us that these three copyists had some connection to source A. They picked up this mistake from intermediate copies that copied from the Anna Magdalena Bach manuscript. Looking at the modern notation, the E flat in measure 3 is noted in parentheses to be in sources B and H, and the pitch C is indicated to be in sources A, C, D, and E. The pitch C in source A is an obvious copying mistake, as the motion of the bass notes is a typical Bach stepwise line moving C, D, E flat, F, G, A, B flat. Here is the same passage written in normal tuning. Both versions, scordatura and normal tuning, are available in the edition. The chord at measure 4 has a line through the pitch F. It is unlikely that any cellist would include this F when using normal tuning. Many chords in the fifth suite are written to take advantage of scordatura tuning. Note also in this excerpt how two markings in the lute suite got transmitted to later copies. The dots in measure 3 appear decades later in source C, and the Appoggiatura in measure 4 on the third beat appears in sources C, D, and E. In this edition, these markings can be compared in detail, line by line. This is a timeline of the Bach suite's sources. The lettering system uses A, B, C, D, E, and H for the known authenticated sources. The use of Greek letters is a protocol for source tracing when there is an implied missing manuscript. We are theorizing that it existed, but there is no physical proof. We know for sure that in 1720 Bach wrote the sonatas and partitas for violin, and it is likely that this was the same time when Bach wrote the cello suites. It was his usual procedure to write out a clean copy, where he often made some revisions, additions, and corrections. You can see the arrow from omega to alpha, both being manuscripts that are lost. Bach was in Köthen during those years, in a position that was much more a chamber music and chamber orchestra situation than either before or after. Two court cellists and viola da gamba players, Christian Abel and Karl Lanicki, are both possible copyists. We can conjecture that such a copy, referred to as Gamma, may have been made in Köthen before Bach moved to Leipzig. In 1726, 3 years after Bach took the position in Leipzig, we have a copy of the violin sonatas and partitas made by Johann Kellner. Scholars believe that was a year before Kellner met Bach. Kellner's copy was made from some intermediate copy, not from Bach's autographed manuscript. This can be verified by mistakes and alterations, and we have the Bach autographed manuscript for comparison. The Kellner copy of the cello suites, source B, was made in the same year. Russell Stinson's book on the Bach manuscripts of Kellner provides the date 1726 for the Kellner cello suites manuscript, based on the paper used and Kellner's evolving handwriting. Due to the known provenance of Kellner's copy of the sonatas and partitas, he was probably not copying from a Bach autographed manuscript. Kellner's copy also had the challenge of changing from scordatura back to actual pitch. Kellner was an organist, so he had no need for scordatura tuning. As we can see in his manuscript, the transcription to normal pitch was confusing. Perhaps for this reason, the fifth suite is the only suite in which Kellner left out music. He didn't copy the saraband, and for the jig he only wrote out a couple of measures. Sometime in the next 5 years, Bach made his transcription of the fifth suite, source H, probably working from his clean copy Alpha. It is obvious that Bach was transcribing from the scordatura cello suite, as he made a mistake in Gavotte 1, measure 26, writing the last 4 notes a pitch too high. The Anna Magdalena Bach copy, source A, was made sometime during this same 5-year period in Leipzig, and thus may have been made from the original Bach manuscript Omega, while Alpha was being used for the transcription. Both the Anna Magdalena Bach copy and the J.S. Bach transcription for lute were written during the 5 years after Kellner's copy. Over the next span of years, 1731 to the latter part of the century, we can guess the existence of several intermediate copies. Beta was listed in an index of CPE Bach, and Delta was referred to by the cellist Pierre Norblin, who used the lost and unidentified German manuscript when preparing the first edition, source E, in Paris. These copies, or other lost intermediate copies, were then copied by the professional copyists who produced sources C and D. Thus, sources C, D, and E are at best third-hand copies, and they contain elements that show filiation in common with both sources A and B. There appears to have been at least one additional lost intermediate manuscript copied from Alpha or Gamma. Sources C, D, and E show filiation with source A due to mistakes that were copied. However, there are additional details in C, D, and E that show commonality with the non-scordatura sources B and H. Thus, Alpha or Gamma had transmission to a possible intermediate copy we will call Epsilon. The Epsilon copyist may have had access to the copy that Kellner copied from, possibly written by a cellist in Köthen. Thus, the later sources are examples of what James Greer calls contamination. He defines this as the consultation of two independent sources in the preparation of a third. Sources C, D, and E have filiation through intermediate copies to both alpha and omega. One must conclude that the earlier, more contemporaneous copies have more validity than later sources. My research is influenced by James Greer, author of a book titled The Critical Editing of Music. He uses many examples from the Bach suites to illustrate the logic used in critical editing. Initially, one must differentiate between reasonable competing readings and clear errors. In the second bourrée of Suite 3, Greer points to an example of a reasonable choice in either manuscript, the ascending A-flat or A natural at the end of measure 4. Both readings are legitimate in style and context. Of much greater import is any case of a clear error. If one source has an error, then it is clear that a copy showing the same error inherited it from the earlier source. It's very unlikely that two copyists would make exactly the same mistake. This is a very important element of Greer's book, which focuses to a great extent on filiation, that is, the ancestry or lineage of copies. Returning to the Courant of Suite 5, where we saw the low C mistake in source A, it got copied to sources C, D, and E. This shows filiation through an intermediate source that connects these sources. Analysis also shows that none of these later copies were copied directly from source A. There are many other examples that show a similar connection. In the Courant of Suite 6, we have the mistake of a low F sharp in measure 14. This is again an obvious error that has filiation from source A to sources C and D, simply because of the chronology of the sources. The Anna Magdalena Bach copy was written probably 50 years earlier. Another example is from Gavotte 1 of Suite 5. After the double bar, the note marked with an X in brackets is written with 2 ledger lines instead of 1. This is again in sources A, C, D, and E. All of these sources are in scordatura, thus this mistake would be played as an E-flat. The pitch is correct in the lute suite and also in source B. Any notes in the scordatura sources A, C, D, and E are read one step lower if they are on or above the top line of the staff in bass clef. The mistake can be seen more clearly when comparing scordatura and normal tuning. This demonstrates that Kellner was copying from a manuscript that was related to what Bach used when making the lute suite arrangement. And the parallel conclusion is that sources A, C, D, and E have filiation from a source that differed from the one Bach used for his lute arrangement. In the Allemande of Suite 5, one can see an ink or wine spot on Bach's manuscript of the lute suite. Here's what the entire page from the lute suite looks like. A rhythmic element is of interest in measure 25. In source A, we see an 8th note followed by 2 16th notes. However, the rhythm is reversed in sources H and B, with 2 16th notes followed by an 8th note. Sources C, D, and E follow the rhythm found in source A. This filiation is in line with others we have seen. And on the next page, the following line of the Allemande, there is an interesting point in measure 28 with the rhythm in beat 2. Here we find that all cello sources have an 8th note followed by 2 16th notes, and in the lute suite, Bach reversed the rhythm. This points to the way in which Bach made other rhythmic changes unique to the lute suite. The arrow points to notes that Bach started to write in scordatura, but then corrected. Looking again at the previous line, Bach added some Appogiaturas in the lute suite. In this particular case, at measure 23, sources C, D, and E also have the Appoggiatura, while it is not in sources A or B. Here you can see source H aligned with sources C, D, and E. This Appoggiatura implies just two possibilities. One, that Bach added the Appoggiatura in his clean copy alpha, but Kellner or the gamma copyist neglected to copy it. Or two, that both Bach and some intermediate copyist added the same Appoggiatura. As the 18th century went on, Appogiaturas and ornaments became much more stylistically popular. There are many Appogiaturas and ornaments found in sources C, D, and E that must have been added by a later editor. Here is the same line in modern notation, both in scordatura and normal tuning. One might choose to not play these Appogiaturas as they do not appear in sources A or B, but they have slightly more validity since they are in source H. A note of interest in this line is the bass note G in measure 25. This appears in all sources, but some editions have substituted a B flat. The lute arrangement has a 5-note chord on this beat, which transposes to G, B flat, D, F, A flat. Also of interest are the slurs on the last two beats of this line, measure 26. Sources C, E, and H have a slur into the trill. This is parallel to measure 14, where sources A and H have a slur into the trill. Here is another similar appearance of Appogiaturas in the first line of the Suite 5 prelude, measure 4. Once again, they are in sources C, D, E, and H. It is interesting to note that the third note in measure 1, the pitch A, is only marked with a natural sign in the lute suite source H. While the key signature for the second bourrée in Suite 3, also in C minor, only has 2 flats, the fifth suite key signature has 3 flats. Additionally of interest, sources C and E have a key signature addition of a natural sign on the top line of the staff, indicating G natural for the scordatura top string. This example from the first gavotte of Suite 5 demonstrates that Bach was working from the scordatura cello version of the piece. The notation in the lute suite at measure 26 accidentally places the pitches one step higher, as they would be in scordatura notation. Kellner also struggled to transcribe this measure to normal pitch. Here is the same example, but with the modern notation showing normal pitch. There are many mistakes that have been duplicated and handed down through published editions and performances. One of the most prominent is in the prelude of Suite 1 at measure 26. It is important to remember that chromatic signs were generally reiterated throughout a measure during the Baroque period. On the third beat second note, there is a flat sign on the B, only in source E. All earlier sources, A, B, C, and D, have no accidental marked until the fourth note. So it is in the first edition, from 1824, more than a century after the suites were written, that an editor decided there should be a flat, creating an augmented second from the C sharp. The augmented second is repeated in sources C, D, and E in an editorial rewrite of the end of the following measure. This is something an intermediate copy must have altered, and it was then passed along to the later copies. It is also a good example that when there is agreement between sources A and B, one can infer that they are correct. In the jig of Suite 2, there is a repeating pattern in measures 25 through 28 with a rising bass line. The last two notes of measure 28, going stepwise up to F, are found in all sources except source A. What we see in source A is a repetition of the 16th notes in the previous 3 bars. When there is a mistake of this kind, in which there is something repeated in the wrong spot, either from the previous or the following measure, it is called a mistake of perseveration. This is a term found in the James Greer book. It is one of the types of errors found in copyists' work. Other types of errors include changes made by the editor, such as just examined in the Suite 1 prelude, and the omission of something, which is sometimes a more devastating mistake, because then we don't know if it was really omitted or added by somebody else. An example is the flat sign in the Suite 3 Bourrée 2 that was an example of Greer's reasonable competing readings. Another example of perseveration is found in the prelude of Suite 4, measure 16. In the following measure, bar 17, the second eighth note is a D flat in all sources. Anna Magdalena Bach mistakenly copied that flat sign into the previous measure, and this was then transmitted to sources C, D, and E. Once again, we see that 4 sources share a likely error. The editor of source E added a flat sign to the lower D on the 6th note of the measure. Obviously, a D natural would clash badly with a D flat on the second eighth note of the bar. Sources A, B, C, and D do not have a flat on the 6th eighth note, which is the biggest clue that the upper D should also be a D natural. The harmonic progression in measures 14 to 19 is therefore dominant 7th on F, resolution to B flat major, then a dominant 7th on B flat in 3rd inversion, going to a dominant 7th on E flat in 1st inversion, then in root position in the following measure, which resolves to A flat major. This creates a parallel between the B flat phrase at measures 15 to 16 and the A flat phrase at measures 19 to 20, as in both cases only the bass note changes, moving downward stepwise. The prelude of Suite 4 at measure 80 is an example of another error introduced in the first edition, source E. The pitch B flat is used throughout the 3rd and 4th beats in sources A, B, C, and D. B flat is in the key signature, but was probably marked as a cautionary accidental due to the use of C flat. Source E marked a B double flat, and many editions and performers have this error. The prelude of Suite 6, measure 91, has a pitch that will surprise most cellists. The final note of the measure is the pitch G in sources A, C, and D. Source B has an ambiguous marking that was probably a correction from pitch A to G. Only the first edition has the pitch A. The G serves as the 7th of the dominant harmony, thus leading to the resolution on D in the following bar. Another pitch is of interest in this prelude at measure 95. The second to last note of the measure is the pitch C sharp in sources A, C, D, and E. Source B has the pitch A, which is very convincing, as it follows the sequence from the previous measure with the descending line in the last beat. This is likely another error of perseveration, as the Unamygdalina Bach copy continues the pattern of beats 2 and 3 with the C sharp, and this was then passed along, as we have seen in many other cases, to sources C, D, and E. In the prelude of Suite 5, measure 193, we have a mistake in source A that is once again replicated in sources C and D. The third note of the bar is an A natural in source B. This pitch is verified by the lute suite, source H. This is again a mistake of perseveration, repeating the third note G of 2 measures and 4 measures before. How this note got corrected in source E is a mystery, and again shows the contamination of sources that took place during the century between the composition and the first published edition. Such filiation can also be seen in slurs, such as in the same prelude, measures 118 to 124. Sources C, D, and E have a slur every other bar, while sources A and B have no slurs. It seems clear that an intermediate copyist added these slurs. This is just an introduction to the many things to be discovered using this edition. The comparison of the sources is facilitated by both the layout and the ease of navigation.